He's the bad boy of the European Union. His weapons, veto powers, and political provocation. No love for free media or independent courts, and some very questionable allies. But wait, can you even kick Hungary out of the EU? Technically, no. There's no direct mechanism in the EU treaties to expel a member state. But here's the thing. Where there's political will, there's a way. It would take a massive coordinated effort, but it is possible. And I'll explain how later in the video. First, let's ask the obvious question. Why would the EU even want to kick out Hungary? Within the EU, Hungary is known for two things: its liberal use of the veto and its growing divergence from core EU positions and values. Between 2016 and 2022, Hungary was responsible for 60% of all vetoes in the EU's foreign policy decisions. 60%! We're talking about major files too, blocking the EU budget and COVID-19 recovery fund in 2020 and the EU 15% minimum corporate tax rate in 2022. And they didn't stop there. More recently, Hungary has blocked a load more: Ukraine accession talks, EU financial aid for Ukraine, sanctions on Russia, and even an EU statement rejecting the legitimacy of Belarus's 2025 presidential election. To be honest, Hungary isn't just exercising its rights, it's weaponizing the veto. And the best example for this was in February 2024, where Hungary threatened to block 50 billion euros in aid to Ukraine. And suddenly, surprise, surprise, the Commission unblocked 10 billion euros in frozen EU funds to Hungary. Officially, these two things are not linked, but unofficially, it's very hard not to connect the dots. Today, EU-1 is starting to become the new norm. Recently, 26 EU leaders openly issued a statement affirming support for Ukraine, saying there must be no negotiations on Ukraine without Ukraine, and committing an additional 30 billion euros in 2025. All of this was done without Hungary. Normally, disunity like this is kept behind closed doors. But this time, EU leaders made a point of signing only as 26. But the problems will keep piling up, especially in areas where a coalition of the willing just isn't enough, at least not within the boundaries of the EU treaties. Take July, for example. Another deadline is quickly approaching to renew the EU sanctions on Russia. And if Hungary vetoes the renewal, then 240 billion euros of frozen Russian assets could be released. And that's not all. The EU is also preparing its 17th package of sanctions and aiming to move forward with accession talks for Ukraine, all of which could be derailed by Hungary's veto power. But it's not just about the veto use. Hungary is also actively undermining EU values. Freedom House is an organization that ranks how free countries are in the world. And when we zoom into the EU, Hungary ranks dead last in the EU on the Democracy Index, just 65 out of 100. So yeah, we're talking about some serious democratic backsliding here. Orban's government has also cracked down on LGBTQ+ rights, banning pride marches, and is chipping away at press freedom and judicial independence. And while the rest of Europe distanced itself from Russia after the invasion of Ukraine, Orban literally went on a so-called peace mission, meeting with leaders in Russia, China, and the US. Oh, and recently, he also withdrew Hungary from the International Criminal Court. So yeah, you get the idea. There are plenty of reasons why the EU might want to rethink Hungary's membership. The key question is though, can they? Because it's not like the EU hasn't tried to act. Back in 2018, the European Parliament voted to trigger Article 7, often called the EU's nuclear option. This mechanism allows the EU to suspend a member state's voting rights in the Council if it's found to be violating fundamental EU values. But to actually impose those sanctions, all member states must agree. And back in 2018, Poland indicated they would block it. Therefore, in the end, this never came to fruition. Next, the European Commission turned to financial pressure and froze billions of euros in funding. As of today, there's still 22 billion euros in cohesion funds meant to support development and infrastructure in Hungary that remains frozen, pending reforms. But so far, even though the money is frozen, it just hasn't worked. And with new global problems piling up, a trade war with the US, an ongoing war in Ukraine, and a slow economy, there's more pressure than ever to move the EU forward quickly, and Hungary is still standing in the way. Even in Germany, the tone is shifting. Friedrich Merz's incoming coalition has said they want to take a tougher stance on Hungary and protect European unity. So what can they do though? Well, we see three possible options for how to handle the situation. Option 1. Simply stick with the status quo and work around Hungary. This is the path the EU has mostly followed so far. Keep Hungary in the Union, but keep delaying the billions of euros in EU funding as leverage. And try to find compromise where it's possible to keep the bloc united. Option 2. Strip Hungary of its voting rights using Article 7. This is what the European Parliament voted for back in 2018. If Article 7 is fully enforced, Hungary could lose its voting rights in the Council, meaning Orbán would no longer be able to veto EU decisions. But the very same problem from 2018 applies, as enforcing this would require unanimous agreement from all the other EU member states, and Hungary has always had an ally to protect it. At one point, that was Poland under the PiS government. Today, it's likely Slovakia, where Prime Minister Robert Fico has adopted increasingly pro-Kremlin policies. Now, before we jump into the third option, the one you've all been waiting for, a quick shout out to the people who made this video happen. Our amazing Patreon supporters and YouTube members. Each week, our EU Made Simple members of Parliament get to vote on their favorite video idea in Discord. And this time, they picked this very video as their winner. Could the EU kick out Hungary? So if you'd like to have a voice in what we make and support independent EU-focused journalism, consider joining us on Patreon. Your support truly means the world to us. Thank you. So on to option 3, kick Hungary out of the EU. And let's be clear, as mentioned at the start of the video, there's no legal mechanism to expel a member state. Article 50 of the EU treaties allows countries to leave voluntarily, like the UK did, but there's no article that lets the EU remove members against their will. But, as the saying goes, where there's political will, there's a way, and we see two radical possibilities. First, Article 50, like the UK used, and we are not talking about Hungary using it, as they won't, but rather every other EU member state. If all 26 member states trigger Article 50 at the same time, the EU we know today would legally cease to exist. Then on the very same day, they could all sign a new pre-prepared treaty, recreating the Union but without Hungary. Think of it as a reboot. Same institutions, same rules, but with stronger protections for democratic values and no Orbán at the table. And as far as we know, there's nothing in EU law preventing this. No clause that stops coordinated withdrawals, and nothing blocks countries from creating a new supranational organization with the same goals. But let's be super clear, it would require all 26 countries to agree on timing, complete national ratifications, some requiring referenda, and most importantly, trust. Trust that everyone else follows through. Even in a very best case scenario, this would mean a lot of uncertainty, and internationally, it could look like the EU was collapsing. So yeah, legally possible, but politically, almost a no-go. The next radical option doesn't involve blowing up the EU, but building around it. Member states could begin creating parallel institutions alongside the EU, forming what we could call an inner union. The idea is to tighten cooperation among like-minded states in key areas like foreign policy and defense, while leaving Hungary on the sidelines. This group could even decide to switch from unanimous voting, where countries have veto power, to qualified majority voting, essentially building a far more flexible, faster-moving bloc within or beside the EU framework. Over time, this could lead to a two-speed Europe, and we made an entire video about this linked above. So, here's what I think. Out of the three options, I don't believe kicking Hungary out of the EU is the right path. First of all, there's really no realistic way of doing it. And even if there were, governments change. Look at Orbán. He's currently slipping in the polls, and the EU might find a much more cooperative partner after the next Hungarian election. And even if we could remove a member state, we have to ask ourselves, what happens if a future government in France or Germany starts heading in a similar direction? Creating a precedent like that could backfire, Badly. It risks damaging the EU's credibility and undermines its image as a stable democratic union. Now, option 2, where Hungary's voting rights will be removed through Article 7, might become a real possibility if Orban continues down his current path. But even here, I see it more as a pressure tactic than a solution we should rush to use. Because let's face it, Eurosceptic voices would seize the moment to paint the EU as undemocratic, authoritarian, and fuel another wave of disinformation. Of course, on this channel, you know where we stand. We've long called for the end of the veto. Removing it would change everything. For that though, we need treaty change, and maybe the creation of a multi-tiered EU. If you're curious about what that might look like, check out this video here, where we break it all down. Thank you so much for watching, and let us know in the comments which option you think is best. And to support us further and vote on video ideas, consider joining us on Patreon. Thank you to our presidents, Jan Schauke, Christian, Peter, HEVD, BJ Unite Europe, Stefan, and Mr. Probot. See you in the next video.